the two leading terms today in energy and climate are energy transition and climate crisis. And both of those are things that do not exist.
I'm Nadia Swart for biznews.com, and joining me today is Alex Epstein. He's an energy expert, founder and president of the Center for Industrial Progress, and New York Times bestselling author of The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. Alex, it's a pleasure to be talking to you.
Hey, great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Before we go any further, I think it's important that we address the question that most people are going to ask, and that's your and the CIP's relationship with the fossil fuel industry, particularly in respect of funding.
That's interesting. I'm curious why you think that's the first. I'm happy to talk about it. I have a whole. People go to my website, alexepstein.com. I have a whole explanation, but I'm curious why that's people's first thing. Is that something distinctive? It actually doesn't come up that much in the States.
It has a lot to do with, I think, the demonization of the fossil fuel industry. And as I've sort of checked the response to previous interviews on climate, the biggest reason that they discredit climatologists that go against the narrative is as shoals of the fossil fuel industry.
I see. Yeah, so it's makes it that's really interesting. So I think what it shows, I'll talk about the relationship in a second, but I think what it shows is that there's what I call a moral monopoly on the case for eliminating fossil fuels. So that is, it's just considered so obvious that fossil fuels are bad and there could be no reason to support them given their climate impacts, that you must be corrupt. And, the expression in the United States you'll often hear is like denier or delayer. It's just like, oh, you're a denier of science. You just want to delay the progress. So my experience was I came to all of my basic conclusions when I didn't even know anyone in the industry. I had no financial relationship. I had no relationship. Period. I thought about these issues in a certain way, which we'll talk about. And then what happened is, so at a certain point, I regarded the industry as heroic, and I really wanted to work with them and help them. So I ended up having many financial relationships in the sense of I would speak, and I still do. I mean, I'll speak to companies, and I would advise them on messaging. For most of my career, the relationship has been I'm advising them, not that they're paying for anything of mine. Then a couple of years ago, I started advising politicians. I started, that was the first time I really needed to raise significant amounts of money because the politicians couldn't pay me. So then I created basically one of my programs, Energy Talking Points, has about 40 contributors. They all pay the same amount. None of them has any editorial influence, but a good number of them are from the fossil fuel industry. But from my perspective, because I've independently concluded the industry is good, like that's something I'm proud of. So it's very different at what people expect because, again, I started with no relationship, but I came to have an admiration that makes me now proud of any relationship that I have. But at no point, including now, has the industry ever had any relationship where they're allowed to tell me what to do. And I'm often very critical of them, or at least certain players in the industry. And I'm much more pro fossil fuel than they are.
It's interesting how you came to this conclusion. I mean, you studied philosophy, practical philosophy. So how did this lead to you building the moral case for fossil fuels?
Right. So just so people know, the newer iteration of it is called Fossil Future: Why Global Human Flourishing Requires More Oil, Coal, and Natural Gas, Not Less. So that's sort of far better and far more current book, which came out in 2022. And people, even if you're in South Africa, you can actually get free shipping on it. Just go to fossilfuture.com, or of course you can also get it digitally. So my kind of obsession since I was a teenager was philosophy as a practical science. And most people think of philosophy as impractical, but basically you can think of it as philosophy studies your thinking methods, it studies your basic assumptions, and it studies your values. And I think with all of those issues, thinking about those things critically is very useful in any area. And so for years, I would apply thinking about philosophy to many issues, but I never really became passionate about one. And then in 2007, so over 15 years ago now, I had this realization that energy is the industry that powers every other industry, which means that our choices about energy are fundamental to everything else. If you make good energy choices and your energy is low cost and reliable, that makes everything cheaper and more reliable and higher quality. Whereas if you make bad decisions and energy becomes more expensive and less reliable, which certainly the latter I'm sure you can relate to right now in South Africa, that makes everything worse. And it makes it impossible for industry to function. It makes things more expensive. You can't rely on all kinds of things. And so what struck me is if I could help improve the thinking about energy, that would be very good. and it would be a really good thing to do. And I really quickly concluded that thinking about energy was very bad, which people might think is surprising because it often poses a scientific, oh, it's scientific thinking. But it's like one observation I think, and nobody has ever been able to contradict, is that the thinking about fossil fuels, for example, commits a very basic error of only focusing on the negative side effects of something, but ignoring the benefits. If you think about, oh, you're looking at a prescription drug, well, you would carefully weigh the benefits and the side effects. Everyone would agree with that. But with fossil fuels, there are huge and unique benefits to fossil fuels, including feeding the world with natural gas fertilizer and diesel-powered agricultural machinery. And without fossil fuels or anything like it, the world would starve at 8 billion people. And there's nothing close to fossil fuels for at least a while. And yet we don't even talk about these benefits. We only, when we're talking about food, talk about, oh, if it gets warmer, it'll be harder to grow crops in certain areas. That you should look at that, but you need to look at the benefits to it. So that was one very basic error that made me decide somebody really needs to look at the full context, benefits and side effects. And I didn't see anyone doing that.
In Fossil Future, you covered 5 undeniable facts about the benefits of fossil future. Can you briefly walk me through these?
So number one is cost-effective energy is essential to human flourishing. And this is the most important, so it's worth elaborating on the most. So by cost-effective, I include 4 elements. So one is affordability, one is reliability. Those are more well-known. One is versatility. People don't think of this as much, but it's the ability to power every type of machine. Most machines in the world actually don't operate on electricity. They run on usually the direct burning of fossil fuels, including most of our heavy-duty transportation machines. And then there's scalability. Can it provide energy for billions of people in thousands of places? And my intention is that the more cost-effective energy is, so the more affordable, reliable, versatile, scalable, the more humans can flourish. And so flourish means live to their highest potential, which for human beings includes long lives, healthy lives, opportunity-filled lives where human beings can achieve fulfillment. And the basic reason is the more cost-effective energy is, the more human beings can use machines to be productive and prosperous. When human beings can't use machines and we rely on our own manual labor, life is really bad because the earth is not very hospitable and we're not very productive. But if we can be productive, we can overcome the huge limitations of nature and we can live in an abundant and safe world. So basically, the more you want humans to flourish, the more you need cost-effective energy. So then fact 2 is that billions of people lack cost-effective energy. So, I give this as an example for Americans. 3 billion people use less electricity than a typical U.S. refrigerator does. So, an African audience will be much more aware of these things, but energy poverty is not something we really think about in the United States very often. We have 6 billion people in the world who use an amount of electricity that we in the U.S. and most of the wealthy world would consider totally unacceptable. So I think of it as cost-effective energy is essential, and yet it's desperately needed. And so what this points to is, if you're talking about eliminating any source of energy, we should be really suspicious of you because the world needs way more energy. It doesn't need less. And then the third is that fossil fuels are a uniquely cost-effective source of energy. And if you look at the basic facts, they provide over 80% of the world's energy. They're still growing. They're growing particularly in parts of the world that care most about cost-effective energy, such as China, which has more coal plants in development than the U.S. has, period. In development. That's what it has. And this is despite 100+ years of aggressive competition and despite huge cultural and political hostility. So you have to conclude there's something very special about fossil fuels where they're so dominant for so long. We can go into why that is, but we have to, unless you're just a crazy conspiracy believer, like you got to acknowledge fossil fuels do something nothing else can do. Then the fourth is that solar and wind are failing to rapidly replace fossil fuels. We hear often, oh, they're rapidly replacing fossil fuels, but they're less than 5% of the world's energy. They just provide electricity, which is 1/5 of the world's energy. They're only used in very large quantities when they are subsidized, mandated, or otherwise preferred by government. They tend to add cost to the grid. The main reason is because they're not reliable. You need a reliable grid to back them up, so you have to pay for both the reliable grid and the unreliable grid. And so this idea that solar and wind are rapidly replacing fossil fuels is just a myth. And then fifth, and this is very important for concerns about climate, is that fossil fuels give us an enormous ability to master climate. So when people think about fossil fuels and climate, they tend to think about only negatives. But one of the huge uses we have of fossil fuels that's very positive is we can neutralize climate danger. So we can take, in a very hot environment, we can make it cooler through air conditioning. We can take a very cold environment, which is actually the bigger problem on every continent. Actually, cold kills more people than heat. We can, neutralize the danger of cold by heating, but we can also use energy to build sturdy buildings, and we can use energy to power irrigation systems. We can use energy to bring crops to drought-ridden areas. And what this has done is that our ability to master climate, including neutralize climate danger, which is powered by fossil fuels, has actually reduced the rate of death from all these climate disasters we hear about, like storms and floods, et cetera, by 98% in the last century. So one way I put it is fossil fuels didn't take a safe climate and make it dangerous. They took a dangerous climate and made it far safer. So those are the 5 basic facts.
You've referred to that in relation to the fundamentally flawed way that human beings perceive our relationship with nature and nature itself. Can you elaborate on that?
Definitely. So I mentioned, philosophy deals in thinking methods, assumptions, and values. So I talked a bunch about thinking methods and this idea of you have to carefully weigh the benefits and the side effects, not just look at negative side effects. And so when you actually look at the benefits of fossil fuels, we talked about these 5 facts about the benefits. They're enormous, and yet people aren't talking about it. So that's kind of one thing. There's another issue of what's your assumption about the world, and this relates to both the benefits of fossil fuels, but particularly relates more obviously the negative side effects. And the reason I say that is there is this assumption that if we impact climate, if we cause quote unquote climate change, that it is going to be very extreme in magnitude and that it is going to be catastrophic. And given what I just explained about how fossil fuels have helped us make the climate far safer, climate is very naturally dangerous. We've already been using fossil fuels for a long time and we've had a certain warming impact, and yet we're far safer from climate. It should be very suspicious that, the next amount of warming is going to be terrible, because so far it's been an amazing deal to have a warmer planet with a lot more energy. So why do people think, and we've warmed 1 degree Celsius, and yet you hear people say, 1.5 is going to be the end of the world, or certainly 2 is going to be the end of the world. But why do you think that? Like what is, and what I think is behind that is an assumption I call the delicate nurturer assumption, which is the idea that nature exists in a delicate nurturing balance that has 3 attributes. So it's stable, doesn't change too much. It's sufficient, so it gives us what we need as long as we're not too greedy. And it's safe, it doesn't endanger us much. And this is just totally false about nature in general and climate in particular. Nature is what I call wild potential, so it is naturally dynamic, changes a lot, naturally deficient, doesn't give us nearly the resources that we need or want, and it is very dangerous. That's why, for example, climate deaths have been so large in the past. And if you recognize this, and you recognize that our impact is not this terrible thing that ruins everything. In fact, we need to impact the world a lot to make it better. And if our impact is far more positive than negative, which it certainly has been thus far with fossil fuels, that's a good thing. We should embrace our impact. And if you look at it that way, then this idea of climate catastrophe is very far-fetched and has a high burden of proof. But the way most people are taught to look at it is they think, climate is a delicate nurturer. The next impact is, of course, going to ruin it. So there's this view that, if there's climate change, it must be climate catastrophe. That's a very common, what's called in philosophy, equivocation. So using the same term to mean 2 different things. People think of climate change as some change, but also catastrophic change. And then the assumption is, it must be catastrophic because the earth is a delicate nurturer and our impact is bad. But that's not a scientific assumption. It's actually a primitive religious assumption.
I mean, fossil fuels have been around for a long time, but the demonization of the industry seems to just have exacerbated to unprecedented levels quite recently. What is the timeline of this demonization and the driving factors behind precipitous reasons why human beings are so anxious to leave it behind?
In the past, you would see the fossil fuel industry demonized in the sense of big business demonization. But in terms of but that's different than what exists now, because what's demonized now is not so much the bigness, although that is demonized. It's the product. It's saying that there's something very wrong with the product. We shouldn't be using this product. We should rapidly eliminate the use of this product. I think that really begins in the late 60s and early 70s with the modern environmental movement. And there's the long history here. But I think the basic idea that got promoted then is that an unimpacted environment is a good environment and human impact is bad. Because if you look at environmental philosophy prior to that, it was much more that actually it's a good thing for human beings to impact our environment. In the past, people more recognize this view that I have, which is that nature is wild potential. You need to impact it a lot. It's not this thing that's just abundant and safe and gives you clean water and everything is beautiful. Like, it's got potential, but you need to actualize that by really taming it and mastering it. And I think by the 70s, one thing is particularly in the West, in the wealthier parts of the world, we had achieved such a level of mastery and wealth that people didn't realize how much impact we were having. So the idea of impact is bad was plausible because it was sort of invisible. So people took their highly impacted world for granted. And I thought, oh, well, and then they could see, oh, well, we don't want to pollute it more. Like they could see something like pollution and I think, oh, impact is bad. And they would equate impact with negative impact, which is one of the tricks I talk about in chapter 3 of Fossil Future, where you equate negative impact with all human impact, even though most human impact is good, makes our environment better, particularly better for us. So this whole modern environmental movement really arose. It got pushed, particularly in the educational system, in the media, but most importantly, the educational system, certainly in the US, certainly in Europe. I don't know about the rest of the world, but it really just gave us this deep-seated view that our impact is bad and that the good thing is to do as little of it as possible. And there were many manifestations of this. It's like, it's too bad. It's bad to use too many resources. Nuclear energy is bad. Pesticides are bad. Chemicals are bad. Like all of these different things, and having development is bad. Like it's bad to impact nature. But the one they found the most traction with is this idea that emitting CO2 is bad. And part of what's appealing, I think, about that is everything we do emits CO2. So if you think impact is bad and you want to oppose it, and also you want a lot of control over people, CO2 being evil is like a very compelling thing to somebody who hates impact and wants a lot of power.
What do we know about the consequences of indefinite continued use of fossil fuels?
So indefinite is an interesting thing because people have this it's a very bad but ubiquitous concept called sustainability today, which is the idea that we want to engage in behaviors that are essentially repetitive. We want to be doing things that we can do indefinitely. This is part of why the term renewable is so attractive to people. And the idea is, oh, well, let's use the sun because we can use the sun forever. Okay, there's nothing you can use forever, right? So whenever we have 5 billion years left with the sun. So, and then there's also all the materials needed to harness the sun are certainly around a lot less than that if we keep doing it the way that we're doing it. But so one thing is nothing is renewable, but the main thing is it makes no sense to pick activities that you can repeat over and over, because human existence and human life is a progressive phenomenon in the proper sense of the term, not the political sense of the term, but in the sense of we're always finding new and better ways to create value. So it was a good thing that we used to use firewood as our primary way of heating things. We shouldn't have said, hey, we're not going to do that because it's not sustainable. It's quote renewable, but there's not enough of wood in the world to satisfy all of humans' needs for heat and all other kinds of energy. But it was still the right thing to do because that was the best, most cost-effective thing at the time. And then that frees up the time for us to figure out how to do the next thing, right? Which then we figure out how to use coal. We figure out how to use oil. We figure out how to use natural gas. We figure out how to use nuclear. Hopefully at some point, so far we've used nuclear fission, although there's a lot more potential there, but hopefully we'll at some point soon develop commercial nuclear fusion. So it's just a totally wrong way of thinking about it as indefinitely. And the reason I'm highlighting that with indefinite use of fossil fuels is when I say fossil future, I don't mean, hey, let's just use more and more fossil fuels for the next 800 years. I don't know what the best thing to use in 800 years is. I know what the best thing to use in 20 years is, or rather I know that for most people, they'll need a lot of fossil fuel in 20 years. And if we want the world to become a lot wealthier, which is, I think, a moral imperative, we're definitely going to need more fossil fuel. But it's really fossil fuel, like crucial at this stage of human economic evolution. Like that's, and so in terms of the consequences of it, what you can say is, I talk about this a lot in Fossil Future, but you can say, well, we know in terms of conventional pollution, we know we're getting better and better and having more energy from fossil fuels and less say, sulfur dioxide, which can lead to smog, and less of all sorts of different things that we might not, that we don't want much of in the air or the water. So, and then the real thing, though, is there's CO2, which there's a question of, well, at the moment, we don't have a good way of capturing it, certainly not at low cost. So and that aggregates in the atmosphere. So it increases over time. So there's this thing of what's going to happen as we have more and more CO2 in the atmosphere. We started out, in modern civilization with a little less than 0.03% CO2 in the atmosphere. And now we're over 0.04%, hit 0.05% at some point. I think if you look at it, I mean, the full answer is we don't exactly know what's going to happen, but we know that it's some form of one significant greening, which tends to be good in terms of the Earth is a greener place. And then we know some amount of warming, and we know that the warming over time diminishes. This is the basic science, the greenhouse effect, where you get diminishing returns. So it doesn't look like this, like where each new molecule warms more than last. It looks more like this. And there are debates among models of how, like, exactly what that does. And every time you double CO2, does it mean it's 1 degree warmer or 2 degree warmer or 3 degree warmer? But the basic thing is you have to get the same amount of warming, you have to keep doubling CO2.
Is this the logarithmic effect?
Yeah, exactly. So diminishing is just a little bit more of an easy to grasp way, but yeah, so it's a logarithmic thing. So it's part of it. You have to double to get the same result. So I can't quite convert perfectly to kilometers an hour, but in the U.S., we use miles an hour. At 55 miles an hour, that's optimal for fuel efficiency. And when you put your gas pedal after that, you get diminishing returns on fuel. So you can't just push down the pedal and it'll go 1,000 miles an hour. It sort of tapers off. You need more and more fuel to get less and less added speed. And it's a similar thing with the greenhouse effect. So my basic argument is with CO2 itself, I don't think anyone knows at this point. I think so far it's pretty clearly been net positive. I think in the future, we don't know at what point it's net positive, at what point it's net negative. But I think it's clear that for a while, the any harms of it are trivial compared to the benefits we get from the energy from fossil fuels, which, as I said, helps us become safe from climate. So whatever climate changes have, fossil fuels give us the means to deal with those changes. So I think that, which is, again, not to say use fossil fuels forever, but there's no catastrophe or apocalypse that should make us slow down right now. And I think insofar as people want to focus on reducing emissions, it should be absolutely through innovating cost-effective alternatives, not suppressing the use of energy. And one thing I talk about that's more controversial is that at any point you discovered that, you had a real problem with warming, contrary to what you would expect. I think what people should be really interested in is what are exploring over time technologies to cool the Earth. Because what's going to happen, and this is a controversial thing to say, but in practice, many countries will not use more expensive energy to avoid emitting CO2. China's not willing to do that on a significant scale. Russia's not, India's not, nor should they be. It's really bad, I think, when places are trying to reduce their CO2 emissions and are really poor. And seeing this happen in some places in Africa is tragic. I don't think there's any evidence of apocalypse. And insofar as people are concerned, again, the path is innovating superior alternatives, or your worst case scenario is you develop ways to cool the Earth. And we already have evidence that, like, volcanoes erupting cool the Earth. So there's no reason we couldn't explore that over the next 100 years. So there's no reason to be afraid about this. And there's every reason to be optimistic about getting far more energy to far more people.
In an interview with Dr. Judith Curry, she actually said that the only climate-related emergency that we have is moving to green energy too quickly.
That's a good thing. And I was glad to see that interview got so much attention because, she's somebody who's been, I think, very courageous and has had to deal with a lot of pushback for what she's done and hasn't been in the media that often. Like, she's widely read by a lot of us. So anyways, great to see that. And I think over the years, I've know her a little bit and I interviewed her years ago on my show. We'll occasionally respond. Like, I think over the years, she's become more and more aware of the energy piece of it and interested in that. And I think the more you're aware of the energy piece of things, the more it is very alarming that the people who claim to care about our climate impacts and talk about catastrophe are not at all afraid of the catastrophe of making energy inaccessible, which is an obvious catastrophe once you understand energy.
What are we looking at in terms of the degree to which a green transition would fall short of the energy output generated from the use of fossil fuels today?
I think it's really an absurd idea the way it's brought up, because I'm trying to think of an analogy that shows how absurd it is, because it's really what we have. I mentioned before, we have fossil fuels providing 80% of the world's energy. It's still growing. They can do these things. The idea of green, but it's usually focused on solar and wind. The idea of these replacing fossil fuels in the sense of doing everything they do now, and then also doing that for billions more people, this is just something that has been made up. So in economics, it's really, really bad to go by what random people make up. What we go by is what people can actually do. So imagine it's like, hey, what if my idiot neighbors, like, what about the transition to my idiot neighbor's ideas, and we're going to replace all the iPhones with what my idiot neighbor thinks is true? Like, you would never discuss that, right? You would just say, well, if your idiot neighbor is not an idiot, maybe he can do it. And so the attitude toward green energy, we could talk about that term in a second, which is problematic, but the attitude toward alternatives is it's incredibly hard to do what fossil fuels have done. No other source of energy, no industry in history has done it. We should welcome people to try to do it. We should get out of their way, particularly nuclear. There's a lot to get out of the way. But we should not just believe these random claims that these things that are totally failing now are somehow going to rapidly replace fossil fuels and stake our civilization on. It's kind of like, you'd imagine in semiconductors and in computing. Like, it's all based on silicon, right? So the whole thing is based on silicon. And if somebody said, okay, well, I'm going to do with germanium, although that's even more plausible than green energy, but like, I'm going to do with some other semiconductor, I'm going to do with something else. Like, you wouldn't just say, hey, let's order everyone to do this random person's plan. You'd say, well, prove it, because we already know the industry has already done it with silicon, and there are reasons they've done it. They've gotten so good. Can you do it with this other thing? So really the burden of proof has to be on green energy versus just assuming that this transition is the thing. So maybe one way to put it is, like, there is no energy transition right now in the sense of a free market evolution. There's like a forced, really, regression where we're forcing people to pay higher prices and experiencing lower reliability because of a political agenda. But we're still using more fossil fuels than ever. So it's really the two leading terms today in energy and climate are energy transition and climate crisis. And both of those are things that do not exist.
With renewable energy sources, I think it's sort of hidden or unspoken that the fossil fuel consumption required to actually get them to use and the subsidies supporting them. What are the basic facts about renewable energy that need to be out there, without which we can't possibly make an informed choice?
Well, I think ultimately the informed choice should be they should have to actually compete on the same terms. And then you don't really need to be that informed. They just actually need to do it. Part of the problem is right now they just get forced on us through political measures and through preferences and this kind of thing. But maybe a broad guideline is, with every form of energy, if you're thinking about it, you need to think about the full process involved in taking a raw form of energy, so the sun, the wind, oil, coal, gas, whatever it is, and then transforming it into a reliable output. And I stress reliable output. And if you look at the full process of solar and wind, you start to learn about all the different things, including, yes, all the fossil fuels at the front end. But the biggest thing is solar and wind are unreliable. So you need this huge backup system, but it's not really a backup system. It's a life support system to provide nearly 100% life support at all times, because solar and wind can go near zero. So if you think about the full process of taking something and making it into reliable electricity, you have to recognize solar and wind are not themselves sources of energy. They're components of energy that require these reliable sources of energy. So the more you think of it that way, the more you recognize, oh, this is just a made up thing to reassure people that it's okay to oppose fossil fuels. Because our whole focus is, let's just focus on the negative side effects of fossil fuels. Let's dramatically exaggerate them. And then our whole focus is, how do we get rid of these? And then basically these crackpots come along and say, oh, no, of course we can just use solar and wind. It'll work. Here's my plan, et cetera. I'm not willing to prove it anywhere on my own. but you should implement it everywhere by force, and I promise it'll work. And of course, it just fails everywhere. Even just doing it partially, and we have a global energy crisis because they've suppressed the supply of fossil fuels on the promise that solar and wind can replace it. But I just want to focus on, like, we have a debate that's obsessed with stopping our climate impact as the focus, and there's no real focus on energy. And I think that's why the thinking about energy is so ridiculous. Whereas the way I think of it is I think of it from a pro-human perspective. Energy is so crucial. We need far more energy. And if you start thinking of it that way and you think it has to be cost effective, it becomes obvious we need as much cost effective energy as we can. And if solar and wind can do it, more power to them. But there's no evidence they're remotely what's needed to power the whole world. So we need far more energy. And I think solar and wind can have a role, but they need to be really required to compete to help provide reliable electricity. And we can't keep giving them preferences that allow them, like in the US in particular, solar and wind is they're allowed to sell unreliable electricity for a higher price than the reliable producers do. So imagine that. It's like a used car. It's like a rental car company that gets way higher prices for a car that works a third of the time as a car that works all the time. That's not going to promote reliable cars in the world.
It was a peer-reviewed paper that was published in the scientific journal Energies in 2020, which found that solar and wind farms, which are these exorbitantly funded climate projects, are actually causing local climate change and having a devastating impact on the biodiversity. Can you speak to this?
Well, I can't say about the devastating impact on biodiversity. Sounds like an exaggeration. I mean, what you can have is, so one thing about climate change, I like to call it climate impact because it's a little bit more precise, because climate inherently changes. So there's no real climate non-change. But if you want to talk about our climate impact, it is important that humans have been impacting climate for a long time. There are many ways we can impact climate, like we can change what's called the albedo, so the reflectivity of the Earth. That's why at one point I think Bill Clinton was promoting what was it, like, everyone to paint their roofs white as the solution, which is not even as stupid maybe as it sounds. Somewhat stupid, but it's kind of like there's all sorts of things that we do. Like if we clear a forest, it has an effect, or if we have a forest, it has an effect. There's lots of stuff that we do that has an effect. And so insofar as you're dealing with wind, well, part of what are you doing? You're harnessing the energy from the wind, but you're harnessing it. You do that by slowing it down. Like if you put a barrier in the face of wind, the wind is going to be slower, right? And so that's going to have effects, like some sort of local effects, and it's going to have local effects to have solar because it's going to, it's going to cover up different forms of life and it'll absorb heat and all these different sorts of things. I think there have been various studies that, this actually leads to more warming in the short term, but then the idea is it'll lead to less warming in the long term because we'll emit less CO2, even though it's leading to more heat. And I mean, I think I think it's important to think of these things, but it's as part of looking at the full process of every form of energy versus only looking at the full process and often exaggerating things for things you don't like, and then pretending that the process of solar and wind is this magical, free, forever thing. Like you really do think of solar and wind as, okay, well, what we're doing is we're mining all of these materials, and then we need to process them. And by the way, a huge amount of this is happening in China, and a lot of it is happening with bad labor practices and bad environmental practices. It has all this process, including it has the process of, a lot of fossil fuels are building it, but also fossil fuels are supporting the whole electrical system because solar and wind themselves can't support it. And then you have to look at this whole process. And then as part of that, you can look at, what does it actually do to the local climate on the end? I haven't seen anything to imply there's anything really hugely problematic, but I do think it is important that people think of every form of energy in a holistic, process-based way.
You've argued that nuclear power has the potential to outcompete the fossil fuel industry, but that it's virtually criminalized because of rising regulatory red tapes. Is this a global impediment to nuclear power? And what's behind it?
It is a global impediment. So, I mean, one point I make is we don't really know the full potential of nuclear, but we know around the world, so nuclear has been a government-controlled industry overwhelmingly. And so what you notice with industries that become successful is that there's a lot of innovation, but what that really comes from is the freedom to compete and the freedom to act quickly. If you look at something like the cell phone industry, now, if you have an idea in the cell phone industry, you can act on it relatively quickly, and others can act on it relatively quickly. And so you have a very rapid discovery, and so much of the evolution of a society and innovation is discovery. You're just figuring out more and more cost-effective ways to do things. Now, if you look at what happens in nuclear, say, in the United States, which for many other industries is something where there's very quick idea to action and huge amounts of competition. In nuclear, you have to get permission. The government has to pre-approve these designs, and that can take a decade or more. And then it dictates exactly what materials have to be. So it's just, it treats the whole thing as guilty until proven innocent. And so what happens is just you have this glacial thing that doesn't improve over time in many ways, and it really regresses. So unfortunately, and if you look at other places, they're mostly proceeding that way. And in some of the places that are a little bit less hostile to that like communist China is not exactly just, it doesn't have all of the, to say the least, it doesn't have all of the freedom that, say, other industries typically enjoy in the US, and it tends to be very centrally controlled. So what we really need, so here's a counterexample, is what's called fracking in the United States. So shale energy, where we've had this unbelievable achievement of people figuring out how to take oil and gas out of this shale rock that was once considered useless, and now we can just produce amazing amounts of oil and gas. But what happened there is because we have property rights underground in the US, people had a very quick, they could really quickly test ideas, and they could really quickly compete. And so you had very rapid evolution in the productivity of that versus in, say, Europe, where it just got banned most places. So it doesn't get explored at all. And what you need is something like what happened in shale and nuclear. And a lot of what I'm working on, I've started doing a lot of political work in the last couple of years, is I'm working on what I call nuclear decriminalisation, where you can have a lot of innovation and people can test things really quickly. But right now it's a mess, and it's gotten much more expensive over the years, even though it should have gotten less expensive as we learn more. Because it's not like the materials have gotten so expensive. So it's really the process has become expensive because there's been so many delays, and many, many smart people have just left the industry because it's just so hamstrung.
What are the reasons given by regulators for this process? Are there justifiable safety reasons related to nuclear?
I think ultimately, no. So basically there's been a demonization of nuclear from very early on. People had this false equation between a nuclear bomb and nuclear energy, but the technologies are so different. Like nuclear energy literally can't explode. So it's actually the safest form of energy in the world. And yet it's treated as the most dangerous form of energy in the world. So there's been all this mythology around it, and particularly as a demonization of radioactivity and radiation. So this idea, if it has radiation, that's bad. But actually, generating energy, generating radiation, like way safer than burning things in traditional ways. And it's really because the amount of radiation, it's really easy to shield ourselves from dangerous amounts of radiation. But part of what they do is they make the thresholds of radiation lower and lower and lower and lower over time. They have to have more and more and more, quote, safety measures that are useless, that are totally useless, but that cost more and more. So one of the things I argue for with nuclear decriminalisation is we need to change the policy toward radiation and get rid of what's called, this thing called technically the linear no threshold view, or the linear no threshold model, which applied to sunlight, if you apply it to sunlight, you see how absurd it is. It says if something is dangerous in some quantity, it's dangerous in every quantity. It says it's bad. Let's say I live in California. It's bad to go out for 12 hours with no sunscreen. So that must mean it's somewhat deadly to go out for 12 minutes. But no, it could actually be good to go out for 12 minutes or 24 minutes. And so many, many things actually follow what's called a hormetic model, where there's at high levels, at a certain level, they're dangerous, and at a certain level, they're benign. But also at a certain low level, they're even beneficial. And there are reasons to think that nuclear radiation is actually beneficial at low levels, but certainly that it's benign at low levels. So it's just, we have so much irrationality behind this There's other forms of emissions that this applies to as well, but it's particularly irrational for nuclear. So a lot of work needs to be done. And I think, it really needs to be done in the freest countries in the world. Like, it's because those are the places where it's no accident that in the US you get so many innovative industries, although we're a lot less free than we used to be, but if there's certain conditions that allow you to evolve ideas more quickly. And I think we're kind of the best case to do it, but unfortunately we're so hostile to nuclear. So I'm trying to make us leaders in it.
You have consistently advocated for energy freedom and human flourishing, and said that climate change or climate impact it's not an existential threat, and that we can adapt to whatever comes through innovation and adaptation. So this is perhaps quite a philosophical way of looking at things, but are we not potentially, by insisting that all changes in the climate are anthropogenic, and that this global push and drive towards net zero, and insisting that it's the only way to stabilizing climate change, inhibiting the very human ingenuity and technological advancement that we need to position ourselves to sustain future generations?
I would say yeah, but I'm curious what made you ask that question.
It just feels like there's a very myopic way of seeing things, and human beings thrive. We survive. There's a very centralized, forced energy platform at the moment. It's suppressing critical thought. And I think that's dangerous, because that's what got us so far.
I agree with that. I mean, one interesting perspective I have on this is, if you compare the way we think about the climate on Earth to the way we think of Mars, in large part, I'd say thanks to Elon Musk. So I used to say this to Elon, although he's improved a little bit on climate stuff. Not that I know him personally, I'm just saying on the internet. But I just say, wait a second, Elon Musk says that we can make Mars livable, but that 2 degrees warming on Earth will make it unlivable. Like, what is going on here? It's just it's this very bizarre view that, you just think about what it means. Like, what does it mean to get 2 degrees warmer Celsius on average? And when people talk about 2 degrees today, it's not even 2 degrees warmer than now. It's 2 degrees warmer than it was in the 1800s. So 1 degree warmer Celsius than it is now. It's like there's something, and we know life has gotten so much better with the 1 degree. And we also know, by the way, that most people prefer warmer climates, and just the idea that weather is going to just overwhelm us as we are becoming so advanced. Like, this is something to have been afraid of 300 years ago, or even 100 years ago, when you couldn't master these things. But now, just take the United States. It's wealthy throughout, from polar Alaska to swampy Florida. We have every climate imaginable in the United States, and we're wealthy, and we can live to 80. So there's this total denial of what I call our mastery of climate, and that's necessary to have this political movement. Because if you really recognize what I call climate mastery, and that it's powered by fossil fuels, you just can't be very scared of climate changes in the way people want you to. So what they want to promote is this idea, the climate was this delicate nurturer, and then we caused, quote, climate change. So the climate was stable and sufficient and safe before, and we destabilized it, and now it's going to deprive us of water and other resources, and it's going to endanger us. And now we have to, quote, adapt. But it's even adapt is not quite the right word, because it's really, climate is naturally dynamic, deficient, and dangerous, and we master it. And so the same thing that has allowed us to master it so far can allow us to master a different version of it in the future. And this happens, by the way, locally, no matter what, far more than it happens globally. So in general, climate changes are much more local, even if there's no global climate change. You have a lot of local change. So it's just this very primitive and bizarre way of looking at it. And I think, as you're indicating, it leads to a lot of really bad things in terms of suppression of ideas, and really just the denial of our humanity, that we're afraid of climate is such an embarrassment. And then it's embarrassing how it neuters us. So just think about I mean, I don't need to tell you, but like, it's so embarrassing and sad what's happening with the regression of electricity in South Africa. It's so embarrassing and sad that Europe is afraid of winter. Like, you shouldn't be afraid of winter in the modern world, certainly not as far as Europe progressed, and yet they've regressed. As one of my colleagues put it, he says, like, Europeans are afraid of freezing due to their efforts to cool the planet.
I'm definitely looking forward to reading your books. Alex Epstein, author of The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels and Fossil Future. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm Najaswat for BizNews.com.